Hello again. Let's start chapter 4, and that is your tissues. In this chapter, we're going to cover these items, so I'm going to go through this one quickly. Let's start first with the definition of tissue. What does it mean when we say tissue? As you all remember, tissue is a collection of the cells that are getting together for a common purpose. We have 4 different types of tissues. We have epithelial tissue, we have connective tissue, we have muscle tissue, and we have nervous tissue. Our body is composed of only 4 different types of tissue. In this table, you can see different characteristic or function or description of these tissues. I highly suggest you, after we are done with these 4 tissues, come back to this table and review your information. So for now, let's start with the first tissue first, and that is epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue has few characteristics. The first one is epithelial tissue covers your body surface. Therefore, skin would be epithelial tissue. Also, if there is any cavity in your body, that cavity is being lined by epithelial tissue. When I say lined, that means inside the cavity is being lined by epithelial tissue. So therefore, let's say stomach is a hollow organ, is being lined by epithelial tissue. I'm talking about inside the stomach, not outside the stomach. Let's talk about urinary bladder. Is a hollow organ. Inside urinary bladder is being lined by epithelial tissue. Give me more examples. How about uterus? How about blood vessels? These are all hollow organ. How about your small intestine or large intestine? How about your trachea? How about your esophagus? Every single hollow organ is being lined by epithelial tissue. Where else you can find epithelial tissue? All glands are epithelial tissue. Your sweat gland, your mammary gland that produce milk. How about your thyroid gland? These are all epithelial tissue. So you find epithelial tissue in 3 places. Covers your body, skin, is going to line all hollow organs, and also all your glands are epithelial tissue. Now, the cells in epithelial tissue are attached to each other. In other words, you have less space between the cells. So cells are next to each other. The space between the cells is called interstitium, and this space is filled by extracellular matrix. In the case of epithelial tissue, since there is no space, therefore we would say epithelial tissue has little or no extracellular matrix because the cells are attached to each other. Epithelial tissue has other characteristics. One we just mentioned about junctions. Let's take a look at this picture. You see in this picture, this is one epithelial cell, this is another epithelial cell, here's another one. Do you notice that the cells are attached to each other? The space between the cells are very minimal. Therefore, there is no or there is little extracellular matrix. So that's the first characteristic that you need to know. The next characteristic is polarity. What does that mean? Let's take a look at this picture, this slide. These are all epithelial tissue. You will learn this one in your lab, and your lab instructor is going to point out to this slide or similar slides. But here's my point. All of these dots that you see here, these are nuclei. That means each one represents a cell. These cells are facing a free space. If this is small intestine, cells that are lining this space. So one side of the cells is facing this free space. Therefore, I would say my cell has 2 surfaces. One surface is facing the free space, and that is called apical. One surface which is facing down, and that is called basal. So therefore, we have polarity of the cell. One side of the cell is facing the free space, we call it apical. The other side is facing inside the tissue, and that's called basal. Let's take a look at this picture. This is even probably nicer. This is my epithelial tissue. These are the cells. Each of these dark staining structure is a nucleus. So that represents one cell, and this represents another cell. As you can see, this cell, facing the free space. So therefore, this side of the cell, this area is called apical, and the other end, which is sitting on the basement membrane, is called basal. Therefore, in histology, we say epithelial tissue has polarity because it has two poles, apical pole, which is this end, and basal side, which is this point. The third characteristic of the epithelial tissue is attachment. What does attachment mean? Well, we use the word junction when cells are attached to each other, and we use the word attachment when the cell is attached to the underlying structure. Here's my epithelial tissue. I know it's epithelial tissue. How do I know? Because cells are attached to each other, and cells are facing a free space in one end and attaching the bottom to basement membrane. This line that you see here is called basement membrane. I want you to understand the word junction refers to attachment of the cell into each other, but the word attachment refers to attachment of the cell into basement membrane. You will learn in pathology, hopefully after you finish anatomy and physiology, the next course would be pathology, and you will learn that in some diseases this attachment will be lost. When this attachment is lost, then you can lose your epithelial tissue easily. The next characteristic of epithelial tissue is avascularity. A means without, vascularity means vessel. Epithelial tissue doesn't have blood vessel. Let's say in this picture, if you cut your epithelial tissue, that means from here to here is epithelial tissue. This epithelial tissue doesn't have any blood vessels, is avascular. If you cut this one, there is no bleeding. Have you ever had a paper cut? If you had a paper cut, it is very painful, but there is no blood. Why? Because you cut your epithelial tissue, there is no blood vessel, and it's not going to bleed. But epithelial tissue is very well innervated. There's a lot of nerve ending in epithelial tissue. That's why it's very painful. Now, if you got a paper cut without bleeding, that means you only cut your epithelial tissue. If you cut yourself and you start bleeding, that means the line of the cut went beyond epithelial tissue and involved the tissue under epithelial tissue, which is this area. This area has a lot of blood supply. So let's get back to our discussion. As I mentioned, epithelial tissue has a very good innervation. Lastly, epithelial tissue has a very high capability of regeneration. That's why when you injure your skin is going to regenerate quickly and repairs itself. Now, let's talk about the function of epithelial tissue. What does epithelial tissue do? Well, if you think about it, epithelial tissue covers your body, so it must be a physical protection. And also, epithelial tissue creates selective permeability. Epithelial tissue lines your blood vessels. Now, one part of blood vessels would be the capillary. You know that capillary is an area for exchange. Food and oxygen is going to leave the capillary and going to get to your cells, and waste from the cells like CO2 is going to come back inside the capillary. Therefore, we say epithelial tissue has selective permeability. Some molecule can pass through the epithelial tissue and get out of the capillary, and some they can't. We're going to talk about this one in the physiology course, but for now I want you to understand epithelial tissue contains some selective permeability characteristics. Some epithelial tissue secrete. We mentioned just a minute ago that glands are epithelial tissue, so secretion is part of the function of epithelial tissue. We said epithelial tissue has a very good nerve ending, so therefore sensation happens in the epithelial tissue also. Let's move on and talk about basement membrane. We said epithelial tissue sits on the basement membrane. What is basement membrane? Before we talk about basement membrane, let me make sure you understand. Under basement membrane, we have always connective tissue, always connective tissue. Connective tissue is a second type of tissue that we will discuss in a minute. So always under epithelial tissue you have a basement membrane, and under basement membrane you have connective tissue. Now, the basement membrane is nothing but secretion which is produced by epithelial tissue and connective tissue. Therefore, basement membrane is composed of two layers. The first layer is called basal lamina. Basal lamina is being secreted by epithelial tissue. The second layer is called reticular lamina. Reticular lamina is being produced or secreted by connective tissue. Therefore, we say basement membrane is composed of two layers. basal lamina and reticular lamina. Basal membrane is the anchorage point for epithelial tissue. Is basically keep the epithelial tissue connected to your connective tissue. A few minutes ago I said cells in the epithelial tissue are connected into each other. I don't want you to think that cell junctions only happens in epithelial tissue. There are three types of junctions that I like you to know. One is called tight junction. Another name for tight junction is zonula occludens. The second type of junction is called adherent junction, or it's called desmosome. And lastly, we have gap junction. Let's start with tight junction. A tight junction, as the name explains, is when two cells are tightly bound to each other. I like to think about tight junction as welding, when you weld two cells into each other. The tight junction happens at the apical surface. Let's take a look at this picture. This is your epithelial tissue. If you blow up this one, you're going to get this picture. So here's one cell, here's another cell. And here is your empty space. Remember, epithelial tissue facing an open space. Now, let's say this is stomach. Why not? So inside the stomach, you have acid. Do you want this acid to get between these cells and come down and injure your basal membrane or even your connective tissue under the basal membrane? Obviously not. So if you want to make sure that acid inside the stomach doesn't get between these cells, do you want to weld these cells at the apical area or at the basal area? Clearly the answer is you don't want this acid to go between the cells and reach to the bottom. So therefore we say tight junction always happens in the apical region. That is going to fuse these two cell membrane into each other here. The second type of junction is called desmosome or adherent junction. There are three forms of adherent junction or desmosome. One is called belt desmosome or zonula adherens. The other one is called spot desmosome or macula adherens. And the last one is called hemidesmosome. Let's talk about the first one, which is belt desmosome. It's called belt desmosome because it's going to go like a belt around the cell. Obviously, this belt desmosome is under tight junction. These are supposed to be tight junction. It's under that because we said tight junction is in the apical and is not as tight as tight junction. In this picture, you can see your belt desmosome. Your belt desmosome is composed of microfilaments or actin, and you learned about this one before, and also between the cells we're going to have another protein is called cadherin. The function of the belt desmosome is making sure when you stretch a cell is not going to fall apart and contract the cell back after stretching is over. So the function of the belt desmosome is making sure the cells will not fall apart by stretching the cells, and the cells are going to go back to the original shape and size by contracting it back. However, we have another type of desmosome. It's called spot desmosome. As you can see here, instead of being continuous like a belt, there is one button here, one button here, one button here. So that's why it's called spot desmosome. So the difference really is instead of being belt and continuous, we have one attachment here, one attachment there, like a button. The difference here as far as the structure goes is we have intermediate filaments that stretch out from one side of the cell to the other. Adhesion between two cells comes from this glycoprotein is called cadherin. Now, the beauty of this intermediate filament is it's going to spread out the stretch among all surface. Let me give you an example. When you wear a snowshoe, you are not going to sink inside the snow. Why not? Because it's going to spread out your weight in a large surface. As a result, your weight will be spread out and you're not going to sink. Imagine that you put a stretch against a tissue. If that force being spread out, your tissue is not going to fall apart. So the beauty of this intermediate filament is it goes from one area to any other area of the cell and spread this force. This is another slide that I just added, and it shows very nicely that desmosome is going to spread out the pressure through these filaments all over the cell. And if you look at the electron microscopy of the same thing, you can see that's exactly what you see with electron microscopy. That brings us to the last form of desmosome, and that's called hemidesmosome. What is hemidesmosome? As opposed to desmosome that attach cells to another cell, we need attachment between the cell and basement membrane. That's why it's called hemi or half desmosome, because it doesn't attach one cell to another cell, but attaches cells into basement membrane. In the hemidesmosome, you have only one cell but attached to the basement membrane. The filament here also is an intermediate filament, and the protein here, instead of being cadherin, is another type of glycoprotein. It's called integrin. The last, but then the least type of junction is called gap junction. The gap junction, as you can imagine, it happens at the bottom or the basal layer of the cell. So from the top we have tight junction, and then we have desmosome, and the bottom of the cell we have gap junctions. The name explains what it does. It's a junction with gaps. The gap guarantees communication between cells. So in other words, whatever happens in these cells, the other cell would be aware of. This gap junction allows molecule to go from one cell to another cell. As you can see in this picture, the gap junction is nothing but protein that attach this cell into this cell. This protein has a channel in between, and the protein is called connexin. I'm going to stop this recording here, and I'll continue this one in the next recording.